The letter arrived 3 weeks after my 72nd birthday. A stark white envelope with the return address of a law firm I didn't recognize. My first thought was that it must be a mistake. My second was that it might be bad news. At my age, unexpected mail from attorneys rarely brings joy. But it wasn't a mistake, nor was it entirely bad news. The letter informed me that Martha Chen, recently deceased, had named me in her will. I was invited to the reading the following week at the law offices of Goldstein and McKay. Martha Chen, a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in nearly 40 years, though it had echoed in my thoughts more often than I cared to admit. My hands trembled slightly as I set down the letter. "Who's it from?" asked my husband Paul, glancing up from his crossword puzzle. "A lawyer," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Someone I used to know has died and apparently left me something." "Anyone I know?" he asked, returning his attention to his puzzle. "No," I said quietly. "Someone from before we met." Paul nodded, satisfied with my explanation. After 43 years of marriage, he trusted me completely, believed he knew everything important about my life. He was wrong. There were things I had never told him, never told anyone. Things about Martha Chen and the summer of 1984 that had changed the trajectory of my life. Things I had buried so deeply, I sometimes convinced myself they had happened to someone else. The week passed slowly. I considered not attending the will reading, pretending the letter had never arrived. What right did Martha have to reach out from beyond the grave, to disrupt the carefully constructed peace of my retirement years? But curiosity, and perhaps a lingering sense of unfinished business, propelled me forward. The law office was in a renovated Victorian near the center of town, all polished wood and brass fixtures. I gave my name to the receptionist, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, with bright blue hair and a nose ring. She smiled warmly as she checked her list. "Yes, Mrs. Williams, they're waiting for you in the conference room. May I get you some water or coffee?" "Water, please," I said, suddenly aware of how dry my mouth had become. She led me to a room where 4 people sat around a large oval table. The attorney, a distinguished older gentleman who introduced himself as Robert McKay, gestured for me to take a seat. The other 3 people glanced at me with polite curiosity. A middle-aged Asian woman, a younger man who appeared to be her son, and an elderly woman whose severe white bob framed sharp features. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin," said Mr. McKay. "We're gathered for the reading of Martha Chen's last will and testament. For those who haven't met, I'll ask you each to introduce yourselves and state your relationship to the deceased." "Lily Chen," said the middle-aged woman. "Martha was my aunt, my father's sister." "James Chen," the young man added. "Martha was my great-aunt." "Eleanor Porter," said the elderly woman with the white bob. "I was Martha's neighbor for the past 25 years. Then it was my turn." "Dorothy Williams," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I knew Martha a long time ago." Lily Chen's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. Mr. McKay opened a folder and began reading the formal language of the will. Legal terminology that washed over me without registering as I braced myself for whatever message Martha had sent me from beyond the grave. The bulk of her estate went to Lily and James, her apartment, investments, most of her personal belongings. Eleanor Porter received a substantial cash bequest and Martha's collection of rare orchids. And then came my name. To Dorothy Williams. I leave my grandmother's lacquered recipe box and all its contents, along with the hope that she will finally understand what I could never adequately explain in life. Mr. McKay reached beneath the table and produced a beautifully crafted wooden box, about the size of a small jewelry case, with intricate mother-of-pearl inlay forming delicate flower patterns across its deep red surface. "The box is in my possession as specified by Mrs. Chen," he explained, sliding it across the table toward me. "She was most insistent that it come to you intact, exactly as she left it." I stared at the box, afraid to touch it, aware of the curious glances from the other beneficiaries. What had Martha told them about me, if anything? Did they know the history between us, the reason she might leave me such a personal heirloom? "Thank you," I managed to say, finally reaching for the box. It was heavier than it looked. Solid wood with brass hinges and a small tarnished lock. A tiny brass key was taped to the bottom. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur. I signed the necessary documents, offered perfunctory condolences to Lily and James, and escaped as quickly as politeness allowed. The recipe box clutched to my chest like something dangerous that might explode if handled carelessly. In my car, I sat for long minutes staring at the box on the passenger seat. I didn't open it. Not yet. Whatever Martha had wanted me to understand, I wasn't ready to face it in a law office parking lot. The drive home gave me time to remember. Memories I had spent decades carefully avoiding. Martha Chen and I had met at Boston University in 1982, assigned as roommates our freshman year. She was brilliant, focused, serious about her pre-med studies, but with a surprising streak of mischief that emerged when she felt comfortable. I was less disciplined, more social, still figuring out what I wanted from life. We became unlikely friends, the studious Chinese-American girl from San Francisco and the outgoing blonde from suburban Connecticut. By junior year, we had moved off campus together, sharing a small apartment near Fenway. That's when everything changed, when Jacob Winters entered our lives. Jacob was in my American literature class, tall, charismatic, with an intensity that drew people to him like moths to flame. When he asked me out, I was flattered but not particularly interested. Martha, however, was instantly captivated when she met him. For perhaps the first time in her structured life, she fell headlong into infatuation. I encouraged their relationship, genuinely happy for my serious friend who suddenly blossomed under Jacob's attention. They dated for 6 months. 6 months during which Martha's perfect GPA slipped, her medical school applications were neglected, and her strict parents grew increasingly concerned about their daughter's sudden change in priorities. Then came the betrayal that I had spent 40 years trying to forget. The night I had too much to drink at a party. The night Jacob walked me home because Martha was studying for an organic chemistry final. The night that in my alcohol-hazed judgment, I convinced myself that one kiss wouldn't matter. But it hadn't been just one kiss. And Martha had walked in on us. The look on her face, shock, confusion, devastation transforming into something hard and cold, haunted me still. She had turned and walked out without a word. By morning, she had moved out of our apartment. She transferred to another university to complete her senior year. Neither of us ever saw Jacob again. He dropped out mid-semester and disappeared from our lives as abruptly as he had entered them. I tried to apologize, left countless messages, wrote letters Martha never answered. Eventually, I gave up, accepting her silence as the punishment I deserved. I graduated, met Paul during my first job at an advertising agency, married, had children, built a life that had nothing to do with the girl who had betrayed her best friend. Now, nearly 4 decades later, Martha had reached out from beyond death with this mysterious bequest. What could a recipe box possibly communicate that would make sense of our fractured history? At home, I told Paul I needed some time alone, just processing some old memories, I explained vaguely. He nodded, used to my occasional need for solitude, and went to work in his wood shop in the garage. In the quiet of our sunroom, surrounded by houseplants and bird feeders that occupied my retirement hours, I finally unlocked Martha's recipe box. Inside, neatly organized with labeled dividers, were dozens of index cards in Martha's precise handwriting. But they weren't recipes, at least not culinary ones. Each card was headed with a date and a simple title: for anxiety, for regret, for loneliness, for forgiveness. I pulled out the first card, dated September 1984, the month after our friendship had imploded. For betrayal, it read. Take equal parts rage and disbelief. Add the bitter herb of broken trust. Stir until all former affection has dissolved completely. Consume while hot. Effects include insomnia, loss of appetite, and the sudden inability to believe in human decency. My hand shook as I placed the card aside and selected another. This one from December 1984. For rebuilding. Gather the scattered fragments of your former self. Discard any pieces too damaged to use. Arrange remaining fragments in a new pattern. Fuse with the heat of necessity. Note, the resulting structure will be smaller, harder, and less permeable than the original. Card after card documented Martha's emotional journey in the language of recipes, her pain, her healing, her transformation. Some were raw with anger, others tinged with dark humor or tentative hope. Together they formed an intimate journal of a life I had glimpsed only briefly before our paths diverged so completely. As the dates progressed through the years, I learned things about Martha I had never known. Her struggle with her parents' disappointment when she abandoned her medical school plans, her marriage to a fellow researcher, the birth of a daughter, and later, the daughter's death from leukemia at only 8 years old, her divorce, her successful career as a pharmaceutical researcher, her eventual reconciliation with her aging parents. The most recent card was dated just 3 months ago, shortly before her death from the pancreatic cancer mentioned in the will. For completion, it read. Take a life's accumulation of experiences, joy, sorrow, triumph, failure. Add the sweetness of gratitude and the salt of earned wisdom. Mix thoroughly with the recognition that all stories, even difficult ones, contribute necessary flavor to a complete life. Share with someone who once knew you when you were still becoming yourself. Beneath this final recipe card was an envelope addressed simply, Dorothy. I opened it with trembling fingers to find a letter written in the same precise hand, though perhaps slightly less steady than the earlier cards. Dorothy, if you're reading this, I finally found the courage to reach out, albeit posthumously. The recipe box you hold was my grandmother's, one of the few possessions she was able to bring when she fled China during the Revolution. The recipe cards are my own creation, a therapeutic practice suggested by a counselor during a particularly dark period. They have been my companions through grief, my witnesses to joy, my way of processing a life that took many unexpected turns. I've thought of you often over the decades, more often than you might imagine. For many years, those thoughts were bitter. How easily you had shattered my trust. How completely one night had altered the course of both our lives. It may surprise you to learn that I've long since forgiven you for that night with Jacob. Youth and alcohol are a volatile combination, and the boy wasn't worth the friendship we lost. I realized this within a year, but by then pride and momentum kept me silent. I had built a new life, and returning to the old one seemed impossible. What took much longer to forgive was what came after, or rather, what didn't come after. You gave up on me, Dorothy. A few unanswered calls, a handful of letters, and then nothing. Our friendship of 3 years was apparently worth only a month's effort to repair. I continued to follow your life from a distance. Mutual acquaintances, alumni newsletters, and in recent years, social media made this surprisingly easy. I know about your marriage, your children, your career in advertising, your retirement. I know you've had a good life, and I'm genuinely glad for that. My own path has been more complicated. As the recipe cards will have shown you, there have been deep sorrows, yes, but also profound joys. I don't regret the life I've lived, though I've often wondered about the road not taken. The one where we somehow found our way back to friendship. I was diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago. Such news has a way of burning away the underbrush of minor concerns, leaving only what truly matters. And I've realized that among the things that matter is the resolution of old regrets. I don't expect this letter to lead to some dramatic deathbed reconciliation. I'll likely be gone before you even learn of my illness. But I wanted you to know that in the final accounting of my life, our friendship, brief though it was, remains significant. That young woman you knew, so serious and structured, learned to laugh from you. Learned to see possibilities beyond the narrow path her parents had defined. Even after everything, I remain grateful for that gift. The recipe box is yours now. Perhaps the cards will give you some insight into the life of someone you once knew well, but became a stranger to. Or perhaps they will simply serve as an unusual memento of a complicated friendship. Either way, I am at peace knowing that a part of me will rest in your keeping. With the wisdom of 71 years and the recognition that life is too short and too precious for unresolved endings, Martha, tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Martha had forgiven me decades ago for a betrayal I had never forgiven myself for. Yet she had harbored a different hurt, my too easy acceptance of her silence, my failure to fight harder for our friendship. I spent the afternoon reading through every recipe card, absorbing the journey of a woman I had known for such a brief time, yet who had shaped my life in ways I had never fully acknowledged. Her anger in those early cards was justified, her pain raw and real. But watching her healing unfold through the decades, seeing how she had processed grief, celebrated joy, found meaning, was a gift I could never have anticipated. Paul found me there at sunset, surrounded by recipe cards spread across the table. Tear tracks dried on my cheeks. "Dorothy?" he asked gently. "Are you okay?" I looked up at him, this good man who had never known the version of me that had existed before Martha's exit from my life. The Dorothy who had been capable of such thoughtless betrayal had been transformed by its consequences. Martha's departure had forced me to confront who I was, who I wanted to be. In many ways, the woman Paul had married, more thoughtful, more loyal, more careful with others. Hearts had been shaped by the loss of that friendship. "I'm fine," I assured him, "just reconnecting with someone I lost touch with a long time ago." That night, after Paul had gone to bed, I sat at my desk and began to write, not a recipe, but a letter I would never be able to send. "Dear Martha, today I received your recipe box, your cards, your letter, your forgiveness, offered too late for me to thank you face to face. If there exists some realm where you can hear me, know that your final gift has brought both pain and healing in equal measure. You were right about so many things. I did give up too easily when you shut me out. I told myself I was respecting your wishes, but in truth, I was protecting myself from the harder work of genuine atonement. It was easier to file our friendship away as a closed chapter than to acknowledge the depth of what I had broken. What you couldn't have known is how profoundly that chapter influenced all that followed. The shame of betraying you became a private touchstone against which I measured my actions and choices. Would this make me more or less worthy of the friendship I had lost? Would this honor or dishonor the memory of who we had been to each other? Through your recipe cards, I've been privileged to witness the journey of your life. The sorrows I wish I could have helped you bear, the joys I wish I could have celebrated with you. That we lived in the same world for all these decades without reconnecting seems suddenly unbearable. But perhaps that is the final lesson your recipe box offers, that even incomplete stories, even broken connections, can yield unexpected nourishment for the soul. That forgiveness, even when not directly exchanged, still holds transformative power. Thank you for this belated gift of understanding. I will keep your recipe box. Your words, your memory as treasured ingredients in whatever time remains of my own life's unfolding recipe. With gratitude, regret, and the wisdom of 72 years. Dorothy. I sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it back in the recipe box, alongside Martha's cards and her final message to me. Though it would never reach her, writing it had released something long held tight within me. Some combination of guilt, regret, and unacknowledged grief for a friendship that had mattered more than I had ever allowed myself to recognize. The next morning, I called the lawyer's office and asked for Lily Chen's contact information. To my surprise, Mr. McKay said she had left her number specifically in case I wished to reach out. When I called, Lily answered on the second ring, as if she had been expecting to hear from me. "Mrs. Williams," she said, her voice neutral but not unwelcoming. "I wondered if you might get in touch." "Your aunt left me something that has meant a great deal to me," I said carefully, unsure how much Martha had shared with her niece about our history. "I'd like to learn more about her life, if you'd be willing to meet for coffee sometime." There was a brief silence before Lily responded. "Aunt Martha mentioned you might call. She said you were very important to her once, and that she regretted losing touch with you." Another pause. "I'd be happy to meet. I have photos, stories. She was a remarkable woman." "Yes," I agreed, my voice catching slightly. "She was." We arranged to meet the following week at a cafe downtown. After hanging up, I returned to the sunroom where the recipe box sat open on the table, morning light catching the mother-of-pearl inlay and transforming it into a kaleidoscope of subtle colors. Martha had called her final recipe for completion, but as I carefully replaced the cards in their designated sections, I realized that completion wasn't quite the right word for what was happening. This wasn't an ending, but a continuation. The unexpected reconnection of narrative threads I had assumed were permanently severed. I would learn about the Martha I had never known through her niece's stories. I would honor her memory by understanding the full measure of the life she had lived. And perhaps most importantly, I would finally integrate this long compartmentalized chapter into the complete story of my own life. Not as a source of shame to be hidden away, but as a complex, essential ingredient in the person I had become. The recipe box now sits on my desk where I see it daily, a reminder that even our failures, our regrets, our lost connections can yield unexpected gifts if we'll remain open to receiving them. That forgiveness can arrive in surprising forms, sometimes decades after we've given up hope of it, and that it's never too late to understand ourselves and each other more completely.